Hello, bruvs. We're back with the After Midnight Ghost Book, a 1981 publication. Seemingly, it is all British writers, and most of these ghost stories are not ghost stories at all, but kind of like humorous ghost stories almost. Willis Hall, the Victorian leather hat box. There was something about the crumbling early 19th century building that appealed to Timothy from the very moment he pushed open the creaking wooden gate. Perhaps it was the delicate tracery of the leaded windows, or it might have been the latent possibilities of the overgrown and weed infested garden. Whatever it was, Timothy was quite sure that Flint Cottage was just the place that he and his new wife were looking for. Susan was not so sure. In fact, she shivered slightly as they made their way towards the front door. I don't like this one half as much as that 30s property we looked at in Thurleton Drive, she said. Give it a chance, said Timothy. You haven't even seen inside this one yet. He thumped the cast iron knocker hard on the flaking green painted door. I'm talking about the outside, said his wife. Never judge a sausage by its skin, snapped Timothy. Besides, the Thurleton Drive stucco monstrosity was almost twice the price of this place. I know, but what they're asking for this dump will be almost doubled by the cost of doing it up. It's in a dreadful state, and in any case, it's miles from the nearest. She broke off as the front door half opened and a scruffy, middle aged man in a collarless shirt peered out at them. My name's Hampson. Hampson? Said Timothy. This is my wife. We've called about the house. Oh, the man showed not the slightest enthusiasm at their arrival, but at least he opened wide the door. You might as well come in, he said. Timothy and Susan stepped into the bleak and paneled dark wood hallway that was badly in need of repair and decorating. The scruffy man smiled blandly. I won't apologize for the state it's in, he said, waving an expensive arm to take in the cracked and filthy linoleum on the hallway floor and the stained and scruffy Victorian wallpaper above the paneling that led up to the shadowy half landing beyond which lay the bedrooms. I'm only trying to get it off my hands. My name's Harrison. This place belonged to a cousin of mine who died. Funny old bugger. 89 years old he was when he went, and never let a woman inside this house in his entire life. I can believe you, said Susan, shuddering at the oh so many years of accumulated dust and grime. The man grinned and continued brightly. You're the umpteenth ones I've had this week. They've all turned it down. He spoke quite cheerfully. His inability to unload the property did not appear to daunt him. I had a whole family of 6 went over it on Tuesday, from top to bottom, and even they turned their noses up at it. What do you got, bruv? May we have a look round, said Timothy, anxious to get on with things. Feel free, said Harrison. Take all day, only you won't mind if I don't accompany you. It's been 6 months since the old sod was cremated, and I'm still trying to sort out his bits and pieces. As he spoke, he pointed into a room that was jam-packed with cracked vases, pendulum clocks, and decaying furniture. I've got a van coming next Wednesday morning. I've got to get that mess sorted out and packed and parceled. With which he shuffled off into the room full of the deceased's owner's bric-a-brac. Susan pulled a face. Shall we make an excuse and push off now, she said. No, I'd like to have a look around. Whatever for, it's hideous. It's awful. Not at all, said Timothy defensively. All it wants is a bit of cash lashed out on it. A wall down here, a door up there, a lick of paint. It's not what it is, Sue. It's what we can make it. Good Lord above, it's miles ahead of of Thurleton Drive. At least it's got a bit of character. Susan sighed and followed her husband dutifully from room to room. Her spirits fell as Timothy grew more and more enthusiastic. Their taste in living accommodation, she had realized, were diametrically opposed. But Timothy Hampson had spoken the truth when he said that Flint Cottage had got a bit of character. It was not the inglenook and exposed beam type of architecture that Timothy secretly hankered after, it was true, but at least the old house was full of interesting nooks, intriguing crannies, and odd shaped alcoves. Dust collector, Susan told herself gloomily. Her unspoken dreams were of clinical utility rooms that came already plumbed for the latest line in dishwashers and tumble dryers. The longer the time they spent inspecting the bare, empty rooms, the more Timothy waxed enthusiastic, oohing or eyeing as he discovered an odd shaped window or an unexpected cupboard. And it was becoming more and more apparent to Susan that her husband had set his heart on acquiring the dated property. It's so out of the way, she said, attempting to throw one last spoke in her husband's wheel. It would take you ages to drive up to the office. I am planning to spend more time working at home in future, he said, neatly parrying her argument. They were standing in the attic bedroom at that moment, and Timothy beamed as he gazed around. In fact, he said, this'd make an idea upstairs study. It's quiet, it's just the right size, it'd be easy and cheap to heat. That's not enough light. That sloping roof, he said, would stand another window. No bother. Susan sighed again and gave up trying. She had only been married to Timothy for a matter of weeks. Their acquaintanceship before the wedding had been no longer than a couple of months. She had known that he was an only child, born of a couple of doting and overindulgent parents. She was only now beginning to realize the full implications of her husband's upbringing. Timothy's voice broke in on her despondent thoughts. Come here, he said. Take a look at this. She crossed to the attic cupboard he had just discovered and opened. At first sight, the cupboard was bare, but then, tucked away on the top shelf and at the very back, she could see a worn leather cylindrical container. It's an old hat box, she said. I know that, said Timothy, but what's it doing up here? He's cleared out everything else. Why leave a hat box? And what's more to the point, what do you think is inside it? Susan shrugged. How about a hat? She said. The trouble with you, Susan, observed Timothy with only the slightest hint of censure, is that you've got no sense of imagination whatsoever. I don't see that imagination's got anything to do with it, said Susan. It's a hat box. Open most hat boxes, and tucked away inside them, you're pretty much sure to find a hat. Not in old houses, quibbled Timothy, and certainly not when they're tucked away at the back of attic cupboards. In all the best horror stories I've ever read, hat boxes contain severed heads, usually ones that are dripping gore. What you got, bruv? Oh, said Susan, with distinct disinterest. She was not a horror story buff, neither was she in any sort of mood for playful argument. She had a sorry presentiment that it had I can't read right now. She had a sorry presentiment that if any head was destined for the chopping block, speaking metaphorically, of course, then it was to be her own, certainly as far as living in this tumble-down, decrepit property. Credit where credit was due, Susan was forced to admit to herself. When Timothy got down to things, he blistered into the attack and didn't hold back any punches. Within a fortnight of their deciding to purchase Flint Cottage, contracts had been exchanged between their own and Mr. Harrison's solicitors. Before a month was out, Susan's competent husband had organized what had seemed like a regiment of builders, plumbers, and interior decorators all scurrying hither and thither. Walls were knocked down, walls were put up, windows were put in, ugly alcoves were subtly rearranged into tasteful display shelves for family ornaments. And while all of this was taking place, a slick salesman had called upon them in their temporary abode, and vast quantities of carpeting were in the pipeline. Before the concrete had even begun to set in the old back kitchen at Flint Cottage, which was being speedily converted into a brand new utility room, fully plumbed for dishwasher, washing machine, and tumble dryer. "I'm sorry, darling," Susan murmured one afternoon when they were visiting the house at about the halfway stage in its renovation. "What for?" said Timothy, surprised. "For ever wanting to buy that dreadful place in Thorlton Drive. This house is going to be ideal for us." "I always said it would. I do know best," said Timothy, who was not a great believer in false modesty. He patted his wife fondly on the head. "You must always be guided by me in the future." In future. Susan smiled back at him, but somehow a little of the edge had been taken off her appreciation. They had officially acquired the property in March. They moved in, lock, stock, and utility room, in August of that same year. They both agreed that it was a total triumph for Timothy's powers of perception and organization. From the outside, Flint Cottage had not changed. There was the same early 19th century architectural structure, the same creaking wooden gate, the same flaking green painted door, with the same cast iron knocker. But inside, what alterations met the eye. The entire interior had been skillfully converted into an eminently desirable residence, fully equipped throughout with oil-fired central heating with two recep, modern fully automatic kitchen, breakfast room, utility room, two bedrooms, one with en suite bathroom with shower attachment. And there was also the attic room, which, as any estate agent worth his salt would print, oh man, in his brochure, was suitable for use as third bedroom or children's playroom. Timothy, as has been previously stated, had chosen to use the attic room as his study. But the hectic business of moving house had eaten into his working days, and for some weeks after they had settled in, Timothy had been forced to spend more time than usual at the office. The attic bedroom, playroom, study remained unexplored. Susan had no call to go up there. She was far too busy during those early days investigating and then experimenting with the whole range of gleaming gadgetry that was contained in her authentic Italian ceramic tiled kitchen. During the early days, Susan Hampson was as happy as any lark. Well, almost. They were well into the second month of their new domesticity before Timothy decided to go upstairs and poke around on the second floor of their little nest. "Shan't be long," he said. "Don't you dare," said Susan with mock severity. "Dinner will be on the table in half a minute." And as Timothy disappeared up the open pinewood staircase, she peeked in at her cheese souffle, which, even now, was rising steadily inside the glass door of her built-in, fully automatic, eye-level electric oven. She hummed to herself cheerfully as she laid out the wedding present table mats, embossed with faithful reproductions of English castles. "Come up here, Sue." It was her master's voice, I can't, she called back, a trifle flustered. You come down here, the souffle's ready. Do come on, it won't take a second. Timothy was putting on his peevish voice, which Susan had learned it was best not to quarrel with. She sighed, switched off the oven, leaving the souffle to fend for itself, and made her way up to the attic room study. Look there, Timothy was pointing, slightly dramatically, into the cupboard. The inside of the cupboard had been stripped of its faded Victorian wallpaper. Its shelves had been redecorated, and now all of its interior gleamed with new white paint all over brightness. On the uppermost shelf, pushed back as it had been before, stood the scuffed leather hat box. Oh, said Susan, it's the hat box. For some odd reason which she could not explain, she felt a vague sense of uneasiness. He didn't take it with him. Of course he didn't take it with him, said Timothy. How could he? He had to leave it here, didn't he? Because he knew its grim and grisly secret. What grim and grisly secret? Susan's thoughts were fixed on the souffle, which she felt was fast deflating in the cooling oven. You know, said Timothy, what's inside it. The gory, severed head, dripping blood. Don't be silly, Timothy. Let's go downstairs. Dinner's ready. We'll open the hat box first. The souffle's ready. The souffle can wait. Souffles don't wait. Let it wait. We'll open the hat box first. It'll only take a moment. There was that peevish note in his voice again. Better, she felt, a spoiled dinner than a whole evening of recriminating silence while her husband sulked. All right, she said. Go on, if that's what you want. Satisfy your morbid curiosity. Get it down, open it. But I'll bet you what you like that it's empty or it's only got a hat in it. You get it down and open it. I beg your pardon, she said, surprised, shocked. You heard. You get it down and open it. She never heard him speak like that before. He was often peevish, sometimes even taciturn, but the voice he was using now was authoritative, commanding, dictatorial, harsh. Cruel? She almost felt afraid of him. No, that would be silly. All the same, it was even sillier to stand there playing out the stupid charade. She decided she would obey his order. Once the wretched box was open, at least he might agree to go downstairs for dinner. Susan had to stand on tiptoe in order to reach the leather box, and that with difficulty, but once it was in her hands, she was relieved to discover that it wasn't heavy. Well, not that heavy. Severed head, my right boot, she murmured to herself as she placed the hat box on the reproduction Georgian table that Timothy intended using as his desk. Now open it, said Timothy. Certainly she would. Why not? Nothing would suit her better. The lightness of the box had proved to her already that she need fear nothing for its contents. The leather strap that secured the lid caused her some slight difficulty. The buckle that held it secure had rusted with the passing of many years. Her fingers fumbled with the fastening for several seconds before she was able to loose the stiff, cracked leather strap and throw back the lid. Oh, yeah. They looked inside. There, she said. It is a hat. Now are you satisfied? Nestling snugly within the hat box was a brown bowler hat that shone as if it had been placed in there the day before, but the musty smell that rose up from the interior of the leather box suggested otherwise. Judging by the old clothes odor that came out of the hat box, the bowler hat must have lain inside the container for 100 years, perhaps more. Timothy lifted out the bowler, held it up, and turned it over in his hands. The nap was soft and smooth and sleek. It was a hat that begged to be worn with a rakish tilt. Susan stared at the bowler as though mesmerized. It nudged at her memory of Victorian literature, like something out of a Crookshank illustration. The archetypal hat for a Dickens villain. It reminded her of a past in gloomy, gaslit Thames embankment, of the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones, and the clatter of the wheels of a hansom cab, of an unidentified maniacal fiend who roamed the foggy East End streets and mutilated women. Put it back in the box, said Susan. Timothy looked at her, laughed oddly, and made it as if to put the bowler on his head. Put it back in the box, she said again, and added, please. He shrugged, his mood of petulance and anger evaporating as he pushed the bowler back into the leather hat box and closed the lid. They went downstairs together. Susan paused, her back to Timothy, as she lifted the totally deflated souffle from the eye level, fully automatic oven, and spooned it out onto a couple of plates. Put it in the dustbin tomorrow, Timothy, she said. There was a pause. Put what in the dustbin tomorrow, he said. You know what, the leather hat box and the hat. What for? To please me. Oh, all right. He made no complaint about the sogginess of the souffle, almost as though silently admitting that its failure was due entirely to himself. He chewed reflectively on a mouthful, swallowed it, and then, on the other hand, though, I might just hang on to it. That awfully smelly hat, what for? Oh, I don't know. You never can tell. It might just come in useful for somebody. I don't see how, she said, trying to sound as if she didn't care. I don't know who. Local amateur dramatic society type of thing, he said. In any case, it might be valuable. Valuable? Master, or genuine antique. I think I'm on the wrong page. I beg your pardon, she said, surprised, shocked. Where the hell are we? There we are, valuable. Genuine antique, might even interest the Victoria and Albert. He paused then, it might even have a history. You never know. You know, do you? Susan made no answer. She had a feeling that he was trying to infuriate her. She didn't know why, but she wasn't going to let him. She ate the remainder of her portion of the unfortunate souffle without so much as another word. He did the same with his. He pushed his empty plate away from him and smiled. Well, then, he said, what's for pud? I guess that means pudding. What's for pud? Several days passed without any reference being made by either party to the leather hat box. About a month later, while Timothy was up at his city office, and while two boiler-suited workmen were busy in her kitchen installing a waste disposal unit, Susan went upstairs and into the attic bedroom, playroom, study. It was a visit she made but rarely. Timothy's study was the one room in the renovated house that she had never quite taken to. Strange how the addition of such a large window seemed to let in so little light. Strange, too, that on such a bright day this particular room should feel so chilly. But she had come up here with a purpose. She crossed to the cupboard, and, after only the barest moment of indecision, she opened wide the door. The uppermost shelf was empty. He had got rid of the hat box and its contents, after all. Odd how it seemed as if that musty smell from inside the box was lingering still inside the room. Very soon, she told herself, she would come up here armed with the vacuum cleaner, some dusters, and some polish, and give this room a thorough going over. She would throw open the double-glazed window, too, and let in a generous quantity of God's good air. Then, having made this resolve, Susan went downstairs and made coffee for the boiler-suited workmen with her electric percolator. It was shortly after the installation of the waste disposal unit that Timothy started spending less time at his London office. Not that his spending more time at home had anything to do with the waste disposal unit. No, it had always been his intention, once he and Susan were comfortably settled in at Flint Cottage, to do as much of his business as was possible in the comfort of his own home. His profession as a consultant accountant enabled Timothy to pursue such an agreeable lifestyle. Not that Susan saw any the more of her husband under the new regime. If anything, the reverse applied, for Timothy took to spending many of his evening hours shut away in the attic study, as well as most of his daylight ones. It baffles me what you find to do up there all the time, she said to him one evening, over a beef casserole she had prepared in her slow cooking electric crock pot. Consultant accountancy, Timothy replied, favoring his wife with a disarming smile. A couple of nights later, under the pretext of taking up a cup of electrically percolated coffee, Susan made one of her rare trips to the attic study. She opened the door quietly, carefully. Timothy was sitting with his feet up, his hands in his pockets. There was no sign of any documents referring to consultant accountancy on Timothy's reproduction Georgian desk. In fact, the only thing on Timothy's desk besides Timothy's feet was the open, empty leather hat box. The brown bowler hat was on Timothy's head. It was set back at a rakish angle. His eyes seemed curiously narrow. He was whistling soundlessly through his teeth. I thought you got rid of that thing, said Susan, once she had recovered her composure. You thought wrong then, didn't you? He snapped. You promised me you would. I did nothing of the kind. I told you I was going to keep it. Give it to the amateur dramatic people, or else the V&A, you said. I told you quite distinctly, I recollect, that I was going to keep the bloody thing. For Christ's sakes, what the hell are you doing in here anyway? I came up, Timothy, she said, stiffly, to bring you a cup of coffee. In which case, you can put it down, get out, and in future you will never enter this room again without having been given my prior permission, and even then not without knocking first. Now then, is that clearly understood? Timothy, she gasped, horrified. You heard me, woman. Bugger off. Susan's cheeks were wet with tears as she fled down the open pinewood staircase to take refuge in her ultra-modern kitchen breakfast room from the brute of a man who was her husband. Following the contretemps in the attic study, the marriage of Timothy and Susan Hampson began speedily to go further downhill. For one thing, Timothy took to wearing the Victorian bowler hat openly about the house, even at meal times, and when she had gone to some particular lengths in order to prepare some favorite delicacy for him. No sooner would the fully automatic eye-level electric oven make its warning ping, announcing that the meal was ready, than there he'd be standing in the doorway, wearing that idiotic hat at an idiotic angle, shouting at her, swearing at her, even on occasion raising his fist at her. Then, at the table, stuffing food into his mouth, eschewing the use of knife and fork. There was a point at which Susan gave serious consideration towards consulting the marriage guidance people, but she dismissed the notion. After all, how would it look if she were to try to explain to a total stranger that her husband seemed to be acting under the influence of a Victorian bowler hat, and that his character changed totally as soon as he put it on his head? Came close to it even, not that he often took it off these days. Goodness, she murmured to herself. They'd probably think I was stark, raving bonkers. Or else, she paused as another frightening thought passed through her head, briefly, for she refused countenance the possibility, but momentarily, perhaps he is. Yes, perhaps it's him. That's stark, raving bonkers. The situation regarding their relationship reached boiling point one sunny autumnal Sunday afternoon. Susan Susan had come out of the back door for a moment, merely to pop into the dustbin a paper package of bones that were indigestible by the waste disposal unit. She had come across Timothy, brown bowler perched perkily, as usual, on one side of his head. He was chopping firewood. The wood, when chopped, earmarked for use in the mock Inglewood. The wood, when chopped, was earmarked for use in the mock Inglenook fireplace, which Timothy had built during the renovations into the pseudo-beamed sitting room. Susan had opted in the balmier days of their marriage and also in the electricity board showroom for an expensive heater that glowed rich and red from realistic looking simulated logs. But her husband had insisted on having real flames, at least in his fake period fireplace. And now here he was, chopping real firewood for that very firewood, for that very. Let's start that sentence over. And now here he was, chopping real firewood for that very fire. But it was not the fact that Timothy was hacking at logs that disturbed his wife. It was the manner in which he chose to do it. Timothy Hampson swung the axe as if his very life depended on it, or perhaps not his life, someone else's death. His face was flushed, his breath came hard, his eyes blazed anger in his head. Time after time, without pause, the axe rose and flashed down, passionately hard. There was a look on his face which suggested that, in his head, it wasn't wood that he was hacking away at all. There was a fury in his action that said that in his mind he was not attacking an inanimate object. It was as if he was chopping away at, not something, someone. Susan felt that, above all, she had to keep calm. She held her breath, staring at him, unable to speak, unable to look away, and all the time he swung and hewed wildly at the hunk of timber. At last she found her tongue. "Timothy! Timothy!" she said brusquely, attempting to bring him back to reality. But it was as if he did not hear her. He just went on insanely, the axe rising and falling, crash, smash, crash on the splintering wood. Susan backed away from him, towards the house. "You are mad," she said, horrified. "Absolutely mad. You want putting away. You want putting away? You do. You want locking up." And then, although she had not raised her voice, it became apparent that he had heard her words. The axe faltered in mid-stroke as he raised his head, and his eyes found hers. He stood gazing at her like a maniac, as if he wanted to murder her. And all the time, the thing that seemed to hold her petrified was not the fury that blazed in his eyes, but the Victorian brown bowler hat that sat raffishly on top of his head. Fear gave her feet at last. She turned and fairly burst through the back door and into the kitchen. Her feet clattered across the Italian ceramic tiles as she made for the hallway, where she snatched up her coat and her bag. The flaking green-painted door slammed shut behind her. The wooden garden gate creaked on its rusty hinges as she pushed it open, sped through it, and then on down the lane. Looking back, she saw that Timothy had made no attempt to follow her. Only then did Susan relax her pace. Stirring her teaspoon in her cup of tea, she gazed around at the ordinary people sitting at the ordinary plastic-topped tables in the slightly garish, brightly lit coffee shop. Once again, she was close to tears. What could she do? Go to the police and tell them what? She acted out the scene in her head. Excuse me, Sergeant, can you help me, please? Certainly, madam. What seems to be the trouble? It's my husband. I think he wants to kill me. Oh, yes, madam. And what makes you think a thing like that? Well, there was this look in his eyes while he was chopping wood. And then there's this awful old hat that insists on wearing. I shouldn't worry, madam. You should see some of the gear my old woman wears, and the look in her eyes when she stuffs a chicken. And in her imagination, Susan saw her make believe police sergeant exchange a wink with a make believe constable. No, she couldn't go to the police. After all, Timothy had not actually attacked her physically yet. She sipped at her tea nervously, then across the coffee shop, her eyes fixed upon a familiar figure. She rose and, carrying her teacup, crossed to where the man was sitting. Excuse me, she said, but it is Mr. Harrison, isn't it? The man who was wearing a scruffy gabardine raincoat glanced up. Surprise, don't tell me, he said. It's on the tip of my tongue. Hampson, that's it. You're the young woman that's married to the chap that bought old Sumner's place. How is it suiting you? May I sit down? Take a pew, Mrs. Hampson. But the smile faded from his face as he caught on to her anxiety. Look here, he continued. If it's about that bottom garden wall, I got my surveyor to have a look at that. It's got nothing to do with the garden wall, Mr. Harrison. She paused, took a deep breath, and bravely broached her subject. There was an old Victorian leather hat box in the attic when you went. Harrison swallowed awkwardly. That bit of rubbish, he said. Yes, well, you don't have to worry about sending it out. I don't want it. You can sling it out. I need to know about it, Mr. Harrison. Her voice was calm. He looked down at the table, avoiding her eyes, and several seconds went by before he lifted his head and spoke. I suppose you have a right to know the facts. Flint Cottage, it was said, was haunted. The story concerned a middle-aged Victorian roux and his wife, a woman with a frail body but a waspish tongue. There had always been arguments between the pair, and always about money. The woman had wanted more for housekeeping. The man preferred to spend his earnings on other women and drink. On one particular occasion, he had struck lucky with a wager he had had on a horse. The woman had heard about his good fortune and had set her heart on a lace-trimmed blouse. But the man had come home eventually, late at night, the worse for drink, his pockets empty. The argument that night was vicious and brutal. The woman accusing the man of drunken debauchery, the man taunting the woman, staring at her skinny unattractiveness. Legend did not say who struck the first blow, whether she laid into him with the flat iron, whether he caught her first with the back of his hand. One thing is certain, the argument ended with the man murdering his wife. He had subsequently gone to his own death on the gallows. It was the man's restless spirit, it was said, that still roamed Flint Cottage. Oh, yes, one other thing. On the fatal night at the cottage, the man had not come home, having got rid of all of his winnings on women and drink. He had spent some portion of it on an expensive brown bowler hat for himself. He was wearing that bowler hat when he took up the carving knife and slashed open his wife's throat. Harrison paused, embarrassed. Mind you, he said, I never paid much heed to the tale myself. He was 20-odd years older than me, my cousin. I was no more than a lad when he first told me the story and showed me that hat box. I always reckoned that the silly old sod was trying to put the wind up me. Susan said nothing. Harrison looked at her curious. Harrison looked at her curious, his eyebrows raised. Anyway, why do you why do you want to know? He said. You haven't been having any funny goings on at the cottage, have you? Susan Hampson walked up the lane purposefully towards her home. She was not afraid. She knew exactly what she had to do. She had to destroy the brown bowler hat. That was all. It was as simple as that. And if Timothy happened to be wearing it, well, she would just have to snatch it from his head. She would toss it onto the flames in the Inglenook fireplace. It had turned out for the best, really, that Timothy had insisted on a real fire in his fireplace. All's well that ends well, she said to herself, smiling. She pushed open the wooden gate and walked up towards the flaking green painted door. When she had not seen What she had not seen was the face beneath the brown bowler hat that was peering out at her from behind the lace curtained, leaded window. The moment that Susan opened the front door and stepped into the hallway, Timothy leaped upon her. She fought back hard, scratching, biting, beating with her fists, but her womanly strength was no match for his maniacal fury. He dragged her, kicking and screaming, by the hair into the kitchen, across the Italian ceramic tiles, toward the plastic work surface where the 3-year guaranteed electric carving knife stood plugged into the wall socket. Detective Inspector Stephen Graveson did not believe in ghosts. He never had, bowler-hatted or any other variety. In his considered opinion, Timothy Hampson was no more, no less than your dyed-in-the-wool, 24-karat genuine nutter. It was, as the detective inspector always said himself, one of the simplest cases he had ever had to wrap up. Within 24 hours of his being assigned to the job, the maniac had been apprehended. Not that Graveson found much to boast about in this achievement. After all, Hampson had practically given himself up. He had been arrested on the forecourt at Euston Station. The railway police had had no difficulty in recognizing the suspect. At the time of his arrest, Hampson was wearing a Victorian brown bowler on his head. In his right hand, he was carrying a scuffed leather Victorian hat box. On inspection, the hat box was found to contain a woman's severed head, dripping gore. All right, that was interesting. That was interesting. All right, that's all.